Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
All right, everyone, welcome to the Stoa. We might have more people trickling in, but it could be an intimate crowd today, which is fine by me because more of Robin Hanson for us. Robin is a friend of the Stoa, and he's joined us once again to share his thoughts on a subject called Who Vouches for You? And for those of you who don't know Robin, he's an associate professor of economics at George Mason University and a research associate at the Future of Humanity Institute of Oxford University, author of a brilliant book called The Elephant in the Brain. I highly recommend it. And he has a blog. I was going to say he has a blog called Less Wrong, but that's the wrong blog. He has a blog called Overcoming Bias. So how it's going to work, Robin's going to share his thoughts, take me back in. If you have any questions throughout, just throw them in the chats and we'll go from there. Allow Robin to unmute himself. Robin, welcome back to the Stoa.
I'm staring and trying to figure out how it is that I'm the only name that has last name, comma, first name on the list here. I didn't mean to be that formal. I somehow typed in the wrong thing somehow. I don't know how that happened, but I'll have to figure out how to fix that so I can be same as everybody else. Hello, welcome. I'm going to talk for, he suggested, the 20 to 30 minutes, and then we'll have lots of Q&A, but feel free to ask questions along the way too, I guess, and Peter will be in charge of that. I'm going to ask a bit of you today. So I talked here once in the Stoa a while back about something that was timely at the time, I believe. I think it was pandemic policy, wasn't it? And now I've got this topic that I've been planning on writing a book about. Part of a book would be about this. A book would be a larger subject. And so I'm eager to talk to people about it and get feedback. But it's kind of a challenging topic in the sense that most people who think of themselves as radical and open and willing to try and change lots of things in the world, they're actually pretty conservative when it comes to law. Law is something that people sort of really clench in and close in and say, no, I don't know if I want to change anything there. That's like precious and sacred. And I'm going to ask you to think about making big changes to law. In particular, big changes to criminal law. And so I'm going to ask you to try to imagine that things could be different. That is, realize the world it's been different all across the world, though now law is very different in different places, and it's been quite different across history. So if you go back thousands of years, different societies have had quite different legal systems. And so I want to suggest that our current system is somewhat broken, and we should consider not just small changes, but big changes. So try to bear with me and see where I lose you. So the key idea would be, first of all, to say law is an industry like many others. So like medicine or education or the military or transportation, or restaurants or food. Each of these industries typically has some mix of government centralization and private decentralized competition. And the question is, what sort of mix makes sense in each area? And these mixes have changed over time. And in law today, especially in criminal law, we have a mix which is very heavily government involved. That is, it's very centralized. So I'd make the analogy to sort of the old Soviet Union food industry. So in the old Soviet Union, the government made all the food and decided what food was being made, and they gave you the food they thought you needed or deserved. If you stood in line long enough for it, you would get the breads you were allocated or the milk you were allocated. And that's how you got your food. And we might say that in the old Soviet Union food industry, it wasn't very adaptive to circumstances, that you didn't get the food you liked best or the food that was easiest to grow in your area even. You just got the standard food everybody was supposed to get. And it wasn't very innovative in the sense that it didn't create good, strong incentives for people to just go out and search for better ways to do food. Everybody just got the same standard food. And so I'd say that's what we're doing today with criminal law. It's a very sensitive subject. It's very emotional. It's very important to people, but we have this one size fits all system, including punishment. That is, everybody gets the same kind of punishment, be it jail or whatever, in the same way, and the same rules apply exactly to whether jail is good or bad for any one person. We have the same issues in terms of privacy and what sort of things, sort of evidence the government's allowed to collect about you. Everybody has the same rules and the same thing that the government sort of runs it and sets the employees, that hires the people who does it, sets the priorities. And sometimes they tell you what the priority is and sometimes they don't. And some of it's subject to politics and subject to corruption. And that's sort of the criminal law world you live in. And so I want you to sort of think about an alternative. So first I want to tell you sort of a bit about how we got here. The history of basically criminal law. So through most of history, say from 10,000 years ago up until a few hundred years ago, in most places in the world, there was just one simple kind of standard law. It varied a lot, but the most common version was there's a judge. And if you have a complaint about somebody else, you go to the judge and you say, I have a complaint. And now the judge treats the two of you equally in terms of you each have to go collect your own evidence and you each can have your say. And you each have the same sort of powers to go do whatever powers you have. And then if you win with your complaint, then usually what happens is the government will make them give you money. And even if it's a pretty big complaint, it would typically be money that you would get. And that was strengthened by the fact that in ancient societies, they could really crank it up in terms of giving you money by, say, enslaving the other person, selling them into slavery or debt slavery in order to pay you, or getting the money from their relatives. So clan liability was a thing where families were responsible for their members. And, that was one of the ways they really cranked it up. And so in the last few hundred years, we've developed this alternative criminal law system, which is very government run. And so this alternative criminal law system, basically the government decides not just what is a crime and running the courts, but the government, hires the people who investigate and then hires the people who prosecute and then has the decision about whether to investigate or prosecute. And then in addition, if you are to be punished, typically the government punishes you, pays to punish you by putting you in jail in our world today, and just makes all those decisions and does it all themselves. So that's the sort of new system. And if you want to say, well, why did we switch from the old system? I think the best way to understand it is to say, ordinary law works best for people who sort of are closely tied to each other. So if your neighbor's tree falls on your yard, then you know where to find your neighbor, you know where to find your neighbor's assets, you know where to find information about your neighbor and information about this event. And they care about having good relationships with you and your neighbor and everybody that you have the same relationships with. And so ordinary law works pretty well in a situation where people are connected to each other and whatever happened was accidental. That is, people weren't really trying to do it on purpose. But ordinary law doesn't work quite so well when people go out of their way to be what we might call a criminal. Say, think of a bandit between towns long ago. The bandit is going out of their way to live their life and do this banditry activity in a way to make it hard to find them, hard to find evidence about them, hard to find their assets, even if you did catch them. And basically, they're trying to make it hard for the ordinary legal system to get them. And so that was one of the first places where the government, say the king, would say, I'm going to solve the bandit problem. That's a problem that I'm offended by. And this is now an offense against me. And I will go out and deal with bandits. And so I will pay for people who go out and get bandits, and I will punish them when I get them, et cetera. And so that's basically where our criminal law system came from, is this idea that the ordinary legal system wouldn't work so well for many kinds of crimes like banditry. And so we needed something else. And this need was cranked up by the fact that we were no longer willing to sell people into slavery to get them to pay a debt, or even to kill them, or no longer willing to take money from their family in terms of clan liability. And so and then we lived more anonymously, living in bigger cities and larger urban areas where it was easier for someone to run away and hide more quickly. And because of that, that's one of the reasons we've had this centralized criminal law system for, a few centuries now. Okay, so this centralized system has a number of well-known problems that hopefully you're familiar with. The state is pretty powerful and corruptible. The government can coordinate among itself to sort of hide any sort of malfeasance it has. So there's this classic blue wall of silence where some police are just reluctant to enforce the law on other police. And so if they get pulled over by a ticket in a completely other place, they might show their badge and get away with speeding, and far worse because, they're fellow police. And that's just a generic problem. And today in our world, plea bargaining is this very powerful threat that prosecutors have against, because the process is so expensive. Most people don't have much money, that the government can just say, you better plead and guilty to this. Otherwise, we're going to throw this huge book at you. Even if you're innocent, you're probably better off pleading guilty. And we give you a public defender who basically has an hour to merely tell you that fact. And that's pretty much all the time a public defender has to do with you, is to tell you, you better plead guilty. And I'll try to get you a deal. And so, this system is, again, bureaucratic. It's not very adaptive. It's not very innovative. It doesn't adapt to your circumstances, and it doesn't try to work hard to find better ways to do things. It's just this, like the old Soviet food system. All right, so I'm going to outline an alternative concept. It's obviously can't be worked out in entire detail, but I want to sort of describe the motivation and concept and work out some of the details with you. And of course, again, beg you to realize the world doesn't have to be the way it is, and it hasn't always been the way it is, and try to allow yourself to imagine it being different. So the key concept I want to build on is a concept of vouching. So imagine a small town in the ancient world, and a stranger comes to town. Typically, the people in town might be wary of the stranger. They don't want to interact with the stranger. Why? Because if the stranger hurts you, the stranger could run out of town and you wouldn't have much recourse. So you have to be careful about a stranger. And so what might happen is that somebody in town would vouch for the stranger. Somebody in town will say, this is an associate of mine. You can interact with associate, because if something goes wrong, I will stand in and I will vouch for them. I will pay back or be on the hook for whatever goes wrong with the stranger might do. And this concept is all through society and history. So even today in computer security, when people put in a patch, they vouch for their patch, and they're on the line if their patch is crappy. We have bonded contractors today, where they have a bond to show you that if they screw up their contracting job, that the bond will be forfeit. If you want to visit a military base, somebody on base will have to vouch for you and say, I vouch for this person to let them on base. You have debt co-signers and surety. Even in, famously in the criminal mob, the mob wouldn't just allow a stranger to come in and associate. They would, somebody who was a made guy might need to say, this is a friend of mine, which basically means I'm vouching for this person, and if something goes wrong, that's on me. And even today, people have had proposals wanting to say, well, to deal with guns, we should have gun liability, where people who own guns are liable to pay if there's a problem, if they cause harm with their guns. And even for immigrants, people suggested that. And today, with automobile accidents, we have this remarkable system where we require everybody to get liability insurance, which means that an insurance company vouches for you. So if you're on the road, usually if you have an interaction with somebody and they hurt you and you're thinking, should I sue them? You think, well, they probably don't have much money. Why should I bother? But on the road, you know that if you have an accident, you could sue them because they will have money, because they have to have liability insurance. And so that's the system that I'm thinking of expanding and calling that vouching, by saying, on the road, your insurance company vouches for you. That means if something goes wrong, they stand in and say, we will make sure that we can pay, and there will be someone to pay. And so the vouching idea here is to extend that more generally, say everybody must get a voucher to vouch for them about all legal liability, up to some large amount of money, perhaps several $1 million. Your voucher's on the hook to pay that much money should you do something, and in a court decides that you are in fact guilty of it. And so now this voucher is on the hook for you, and we were going to elaborate this proposal. Now, just to be clear in concepts here, I want to distinguish what I'm proposing to change from what I'm proposing not to change. So every proposal for changing the world should not change everything. You should change some parts of the world and not others. And you should make clear what you're not changing and what you are. And then obviously you can't be fixing all the problems and the things you're not changing, but hopefully you're fixing some of the problems and the things you are changing. So here in my proposal, I'm not going to change how we decide or what we've decided are crimes. That is, whether drugs a crime or prostitution is a crime or jaywalking is a crime. Some other process decides that, and I'm not changing that. There's also a process, a court process, by which if any one person is accused of drugs or jaywalking, you make a case in court and a judge hears both sides and makes a decision, and I'm not changing that process either. So we're going to leave alone the court process of how you decide if somebody's guilty in court, and we're going to leave alone the decision of what is a crime, such that it's the sort of thing you might be found guilty of. But I am going to change the following things. I'm going to change how people are punished for crimes when they are found guilty. I'm going to change how we decide who has what freedoms in terms of curfews or ankle bracelets or restraining orders, or whether they're allowed to carry a gun or things like that. I'm going to change how we even decide who has what privacy rights. And I'm even going to change how we decide who investigates which crimes and gives them what priority. So that's a lot to change, but I'm not going to change the definition. So if I make the system more efficient, that may well not make the world a better place if in fact we have bad laws for what's a crime. If we shouldn't be making jaywalking a crime, but we do, then we will more efficiently prevent people from jaywalking. And that's a bad thing if jaywalking is a good thing to have happen and we've screwed up by making it a crime. So again, I can't fix everything all at once, or I shouldn't try. I'm going to try to fix the parts of the system I've described, which is how we decide how to punish, how to investigate, what freedoms and limits there are on investigations. And that's enough, I think. So let's get to the core of the proposal. Now, the core of the proposal is everyone needs to get a voucher to cover all their legal liability, up to some big amount of money. I'm not sure exactly how big, but several million perhaps. And there's some, hard to decide yet how long-term a contract it is, but let's just say your voucher's on the hook until you can get somebody else to be your voucher. And if things go bad, they're on the hook for that. It's like a health insurer for the year. Like if your health goes south, they can't dump you in the middle of the year. They've got a contract. So your voucher's on the hook for you. And this allows basically all but one crime to be officially punished by fines, dollar fines paid by your voucher. Now, these fines are set by the government process that decides what is a crime, and that sort of sets that priority. So we can decide what's a bigger crime or not by changing the fine, and we can also make the fine, say, depend on someone's wealth or other context if we want. But the key thing is, through this other process I'm not changing, the government decides what are the fines for crimes, for each crime, but everything's punished by a crime that your voucher pays. But you and your voucher make a contract, and we will enforce that. And that contract can cover a lot of details, including how you will otherwise be punished. So, you're found guilty of robbery. The voucher has to pay $100,000 on your behalf because you were found guilty of robbery. And then your contract with your voucher now specifies what else happens to you. And that might be prison of various qualities. It might be torture. It might be exile. It might be some sort of educational program, detox, whatever it is. You and your voucher will have figured that out, and that will be the contract will be enforced. So and your contract with your voucher not only specifies how much you pay them to be your voucher, of course, it also specifies how you're punished in various circumstances, what sort of rights you have in terms of privacy rights or freedom of movement rights or rights of guns. And in addition, you could specify co-liability. That is, you and a group of 5 friends could all get together and say, if any one of us is found guilty, we will all be punished. And now we stand for each other. And so we go to a voucher together and say, you can trust us more now because we are on the hook for each other, and therefore you should offer us a lower premium. So that's sort of the key concept here. The only crime that we can't have punished by fine is the crime of not having a voucher. And there are relatively straightforward ways, I think, to sort of make sure. If you think today, basically almost no one on the road ever drives without a license plate on the road because it's such an easy thing to notice that they don't have and easy to enforce. And we could just do a similar thing for making sure everybody had a voucher. All right, so the last part of the proposal, which is somewhat optional, but I think it fits together, is that we now, since crimes are punished by fines, we now use bounty hunters to catch crimes. So every crime has a fine and a bounty. Those numbers could be similar, but they don't have to be exactly the same. And the bounty is how much the bounty hunter gets if they manage to come to court and convince the court that you are guilty of this crime. And now the bounty hunters do not have a blue wall of silence because they do not protect each other. They are each eager to make the bounties. And if another police violates a rule, then there's a bounty there to be had by prosecuting the other police. And therefore they do. Just like lawyers are willing to have lawsuits against other lawyers, and detectives are willing to investigate other detectives. bounty hunters would be happy to take in bounties on other bounty hunters. So the key proposal here is what I've just outlined. Everybody has to have a voucher. The voucher and you have a client contract. We allow a wide range of those clients. The advantages of the system now are that you and your voucher will search in a large space of contracts to find what will get you to not commit crimes, because they're on the hook for paying for them. They don't, you and they both don't want that. So it'll be adapted to your circumstances, whatever works for you as a threat or a limitation. And this system will innovate, that a system will have some initial set of practices, but they will search and try different sorts of things that could work to make crimes not happen. And those are big advantages here. In addition, we're going to cut corruption by breaking the blue wall of silence. And ordinary lawsuits now no longer need to focus on deep pockets. So today, you know that if you have something goes wrong, if you go to a lawyer, say, I want to sue, look at what they did to me. And the lawyer will say, well, the person who hurt you doesn't really have any money. Let's look for somebody nearby who has some money to sue. And that's a problem because we don't actually hold the people who cause problems responsible. We hold somebody nearby with lots of money responsible. So here, everybody would be responsible in the sense that if they did something to hurt you, you could sue them and they would have money to pay. So these are sort of big advantages of the system. And my last thing I want to just say here is, I know you have some thoughts about what problems might occur in the system, and I've already heard a lot of them, and I'm just going to go through a couple of them first, and then let you mention other problems that occur to you. But I've already heard a lot of problems. So if you might say, won't this let rich people be excused because they find it easier to pay fines? I'd say we can make the fine depend on how rich you are. And so, for example, in Germany, if you have a speeding ticket, it's so many hours of wages that you have to pay. So if you earn more wages, you'll have to pay a larger fine. If people, of course, might pick their vouchers badly, and you could regulate, say, to some degree, the choice of vouchers, but I'd rather keep the regulation light and let people learn from experience and let them change regularly. But you could regulate that. Initially, the only criteria for a voucher fundamentally is that they could pay. They stand in for you and they say, if this person is guilty, I will pay. That's the fundamental criteria. Vouchers could, in principle, collude with each other, but this would be a pretty large industry and make that hard. Today, lawyers across the world don't collude that much, except through government regulation that, who's allowed to be a lawyer, and detectives don't collude that much. And, this would be pretty hard to collude, but you could have antitrust regulations to deal with that if it was an issue. We could have a way to just check that everybody has a voucher by, say, requiring them to have some sort of RFID tags that can be pinged to give their ID number that would then be looked up in a database showing that that's a valid voucher. Of course, bounty hunters would have some sort of incentive to try to make up evidence to get bounties, but that's just generically true of the law today. I mean, if you can sue somebody and get money by the courts believing you, then people do have an incentive to make up evidence, and the courts need to be skeptical of that, as they always are. You might enforce bad laws here. So if on average law is just bad, then we should just be making it less efficient, not more efficient. And that's a separate thing to be fixing. Here, the system has less discretion. Many people seem to like the idea that, say, if the cop pulls them over for speeding, they have the discretion to let them go, and you bat your eyes or show them your affiliation and they'll let you go. And this is not a system with a lot of discretion. Bounty hunters will not give you a lot of discretion. The judge will have some discretion. So the judge in a case could decide one way or the other, but the bounty hunters themselves would not have discretion. And perhaps the problem that most bothers many people, perhaps correctly, is to imagine, well, what happens if someone is a bad risk? What happens to the bad risk? So somebody may have a previous track record of being a convict and look personality-wise like they might well be a convict. And if a voucher company looks at them and says, you're a high premium, and demands a high premium, and they can't pay, what happens? So the first thing to realize is the premium will depend on the contract terms. So for example, let's imagine there's a logging farm in northern Minnesota. You go live on the camp at the logging farm and you log, and then in the evenings you're in your cabin, and once a week you get to go into town under escort, and they get to read your emails, etc. Well, you're going to be a pretty low risk, and you could probably handle the premium there given those contract terms. So that would be something like being on parole or being in a restricted condition. This sort of arrangement would end up inducing people who look like bad risks to have more limited freedoms and more limited options in order to convince the voucher that they are safe enough to be allowed around. If you feel sorry for them, we could, of course, hand them more money for which they could afford more premiums, which then allows them more freedoms. But now, presumably, we can be selective about who we think is worthy to hand these subsidies to in order to give them more freedoms, because, in some sense, that's coming at the cost of risks they are imposing on others, because that's why the voucher is demanding higher premiums. They expect more crime from them, which, if you believe the law is set up to prevent harm, is, about harm that others would suffer. And there are some issues about if the fine and bounty get too different, then there's incentive problems, and you could ask about that. We could talk about that, but and I haven't really explained to you sort of how fines might vary with the chance of getting caught, but I have a proposal for how to do that. Basically, as you have fewer freedoms or more, fewer limits on your on privacy, etc., then that changes the chance that if you do something, you'll get caught, and we can use a mechanism to sort of adjust the fines for that, and I have a sort of deal about that. But my fundamental pitch here is, and now I'm finishing, to say you live in a world with a familiar criminal law system. It seems like that's the ocean you live in. It would just have to be that way. History was not at all always that way. History has had very different criminal law systems and legal systems in different times and places. The future doesn't have to be the same either. So I'm asking you to consider a wider range of options, a different mix of what is private and what is government run within the law industry, just like you might think of a different mix in the medical industry or education industry. We could switch the mix of who does what. Here I'm saying, let's have more private involvement in choosing punishments and investigations and choices of limits on investigations or ease of investigation. Let's let people choose those things privately, given their own incentives and their own ends, but still let the government decide what is a crime and what are the priorities of each crime, i.e. the fine and the bounty, how much effort to get people to not do it and how much effort to catch it if it happens. And that's my talk.
Cool. So is there anything you'd like us to, like any additional frames? Like, do you want us to stress test your idea, just ask you questions about it?
I mean, I'm sure people just have an honest reaction to this, and I want to just engage their honest reaction and like get into the issues they have. I'm sure many people aren't entirely comfortable with it. They have some concerns, and that's completely valid. And I would just like to get into their concerns.
Great. So I'm going to take in Maybe Gray, our resident law student / modern sex columnist / clown. So maybe you're up.
Thanks for the lovely introduction. That captured me in a nutshell very well. What I'm curious about is that what I see in this proposal is a sort of decentralizing of a lot of what is currently at the government level of the legal system. And what I wonder about is right now, all of that stuff has a bunch of constitutional kind of framework that it has to fit within. Would you be looking to have vouchers and bounty hunters bound by some sort of constitution that sets out the parameters of what you can do? Or I'm just curious about how this marriage of what is
right.
contract law and criminal law right now is going to come and fit under what we see as the supreme
right.
laws in the constitutional framework.
So, I mean, just to be clear to everyone here, lawyers, somewhat rightly, are obsessed with the actual law as it is and trying to make sure that any one thing anybody does is framed in terms of, well, which current laws is that violating or overturning and which laws is that within? Because typically the legal system only makes pretty modest, minor changes to the law at any one moment. And large changes tend to be the accumulation of many small changes. And so I have not crafted an optimal strategy for incrementally producing this outcome. I am just thinking what system would make sense. And then, it would perfectly valid to say, and what constitutional limits might you want to have within such a system? But that's different than the question of what parts of the system would be allowed by the current constitutional limits. And so I'm not an expert on current constitutional limits, and I expect that a lot of this would violate various current interpretations. And nevertheless, I still think it's worth thinking about how we might do things differently. So, for example, you could well make constraints on the voucher-client relationship, and then they would have to be within those constraints. But I want to first ask, well, what constraints would be a good idea? How can we think about good or bad constraints first, rather than just saying, well, the Constitution says this, therefore we must keep doing this. So I'm not, obviously in this context at least, feeling very constrained by precedent of the existing Constitution or of any one country or any one thing. I'm just saying, like, what could work? What seems like it would be a good idea? And then, yeah. So if you want to ask me, like, where would I first propose trying this? I might say, how about parole? How about when somebody's in jail and we're thinking of letting them out on parole, we say, well, let's let a voucher make that decision. Because in that context, the jails have the choice whether to keep them in jail or let them out. And they're trying to make that choice based on, some information they get. But here you could say, well, let's let the voucher make the choice. We'll put up, a set of fines that if you're out on parole and you do something, then the voucher will have to pay a fine. And now we will let this market decide, can you find a voucher at a low enough premium to let you out and let you be safe on parole? So I think there'd be much fewer constitutional limits on that initial proposal or trial. But of course, that would just be intended to be a trial to show that it could work so that you could do it more places.
Do you mind if I just maybe I'll rephrase it so
Please.
that I'm not using my law brain and like being like, how are you going to rely on precedent? Is there anything that you would, like, off the top of your head, think needs to be an overarching rule? Like, you can't agree to your voucher that you'll be their slave, like, or any sort of like rules that are going to apply to everybody in the system so that people can't use this new proposal to do something that would be unconscionable in some way.
Well, again, remember, I'm not changing the court system or what the crimes are. So, all those laws are available to be chosen and they would apply to this system as well. If you can't be a slave, then you can't be a slave here as well. I mean, so I guess, I'm not necessarily seeing many specific connections I would propose. I would just say, this is just a mechanism within a larger society, and the larger society will make whatever limits it has. And, for example, if you want to say that the vouchers can't discriminate among clients on the basis of gender or race or religion, then you could say that. I don't know if I agree with that as a good idea, but you could certainly make that rule, and then they would have to satisfy that rule.
Super interesting to think about. Thanks so much, Robin.
All right, I'm going to read David's question first, and then I'll take in Evan and Sahil. So this is from David. Have you thought about prototyping and testing your proposal in cyberspace, the online virtual world? How would that work?
I mean, I know that often whenever I give any sort of economics talk about how the world might be different, some people say, well, why don't you try it in a virtual world? And in my experience, it's not actually any easier to get virtual worlds to try things than real worlds to try things. I'm just interested in getting anybody to try something. So I'm happy to take, if somebody in some virtual world says, yes, I'm interested in trying this, I would be eager to work with them to do it. But if some church says they want to try it, I'd be happy to work with the church to do it, or a gardening club or anybody. Basically the fact is, any world, virtual or not, people have some way they've been doing things and they're reluctant to change. And even if you have some crazy proposal that they think sounds promising, they usually go, let somebody else try that. I don't want to be the one to try your crazy proposal because we've got a world and we like what we're doing. And that's pretty much as true as virtual worlds as it is of real worlds. Most virtual worlds, they don't want to change what they're doing for some economist who has some crazy proposal. They want to do their virtual world.
All right. Evan, I'll take you in next.
All right, thank you, Robin and Peter. So my question is about how do we avoid toxic power dynamics between voucher and vouchee? So I'm specifically interested in the idea that if we require people to hold, say, general liability insurance in this manner that you're describing, then those of us without adequate assets to self-insure will be vulnerable to predation and bad faith dealing by those with more assets who can act as the voucher. In analogy to car liability insurance, it's costly and time-consuming for a consumer to research and find and sign up with an insurer. And when we do so, we actually have access to only a very poor quality signal as to how this insurer will actually treat us when we need their services or their vouching. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about how we avoid such dynamics in the system you're proposing.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but your concern is a concern about all relationships. Anytime you have a relationship with someone else, including the automobile liability insurer or a employer or a school or a spouse or a family, any relationship whatsoever that you have with any one other person or organization, in principle, you could get tied to that relationship, and that gives the other party some negotiating power over you, and you may resent their negotiating power over you because you don't want to have to go out and find a new relationship. You'd rather stick with this one, but on the other hand, they're being demanding about the relationship. So that's just the generic nature of relationships all through human society, is that we often get stuck in relationships that we're not entirely happy with, but we're not entirely willing to leave. So this would again be, like those many other relationships which are important to you, like your spouse or your employer or your landlord. It's a relationship that, you may get tied into because you get to know each other and it would be awkward to switch. But the main discipline we have in our larger society over these relationships is, in fact, competition of other people to take your relationship. If you're in a bad marriage, the main out you have is to divorce and get a new marriage or a new relationship. If you don't like your landlord, you should be able to move out and find a new landlord, right? Etc. So here, the main discipline I would propose or focus on for your voucher is the fact that there are thousands of vouchers you could choose from. And if this voucher is being unfriendly, then you want to switch to another. Now, as you mentioned, some kinds of relationships are a mix of frequent short-term small stakes and infrequent large stakes, which you don't have as much experience with. And that's, of course, also true of marriages and employers and landlords and lots of other situations. And our generic solution there is to try to make sure people hear about rare cases. We have stories and movies about them, or even, make sure that, and then, some way in which in rare cases, you might be even easier to get out or to swap for a replacement. You'd like to make sure that, so that might be sort of part of the vouching contract, might be who gets to break the contract when. So if you're more concerned with the clients than the vouchers, you might say, well, the voucher's stuck with the contract, but maybe the client can break it at any time. And that asymmetry might then make you feel more assured that so something like we have such things like for employers say, if you want to quit your job, you're basically always allowed to quit your job, but they aren't always allowed to quit being your employer. Or your landlord can't just kick you out at any time, but you can walk out at any time. And so we have often some asymmetry in sort of who has how much commitment to the relationship to partially address those sorts of concerns. But again, I would just point to competition generically as generic solution of why you trust your landlord or your employer or your school or, all the other relationships you have in your life.
Okay, so quick follow-up then, because I hear what you're saying. I'm mainly agree with it. My question is more specifically, I guess, there's an implied premise there. I see minimizing the coercive power of differences in assets as a sort of primary desideratum for a legal system. And so I'm wondering if that's something that you're explicitly taking into account here, that you think this system would do better than current systems of, say, just more specific liability insurance. And if not, is there any way we can sort of, again, make it less easy for people with lots of assets to coerce people without that many assets?
So I'm not seeing the asset coercion here. I mean, I see generically financial or income inequality, asset inequality as a feature of society that many people don't like, and they were doing something to reduce. This solution doesn't, I think, exasperate or reduce particularly the problem. It's just somewhat independent of the problem. So I don't think it gets in the way of whatever solutions you have. If you want to do financial redistribution as a way to deal with financial inequality, this won't stop you. This will step aside and let you do it if you want to, but you'll have to get society's approval for that. This won't encourage it either. It's just a separate issue.
Thank you, Evan. Sahil, you're up next.
Yeah. Hey, hi, Robin. This is really exciting for me. You're one of my biggest heroes alive today. So my question is, as you said, you're not in the business of changing what the laws are, just making it highly efficient. let's say laws stay as they are today. Would you want it to become unilaterally efficient today? How do we do the cost benefit calculations here? Have you done some?
Well, I mean, the simple counterfactual is say, what if we just cancel all laws? Just shut down the legal system tomorrow. Like, are you okay with that? Do you think that's a better world than the world you live in? And I'm going to go, no. How about if I say, let's shut down all criminal law? We'll leave the civil law, contract law part of the system alone, but we'll just shut down all criminal law. Is that a better world? And I'm going to, no, I'm not. So even if there's a lot of particular laws I disapprove of, perhaps even including jaywalking, laws against jaywalking, I'm not eager to just shut the entire system down and say, no more criminal law, go for it, everyone. Just like do what you would do without considering criminal law. That just doesn't look like an improvement to me. So I've got to say that on average, I think the law is helping, even if I disapprove of many specific laws, which I do.
Right. But so you're saying extreme inefficiency is bad, and I agree with you, but it's not clear to me. It's not clear to me that you made an argument or a calculation for extreme efficiency. You might worry that if you really highly power up the system without really aligning it in a way, like you might want to say, hey, let's wait 200 years and let's think about law a little bit more before injecting this extreme efficiency. Is that something that you've considered? Is that something that you can actually calculate and say, okay, we want to wait for such and such improvements before we put all this energy into the system?
So as an economist, I usually think in terms of marginal analysis. That is, what would be the effect of a small change? So here I got to say, do I think a small change to have a stronger enforcement of the laws we have is better? Yeah, because I think the 0 point would be worse. And I don't see any strong reason to think that we've, reached some point of diminishing returns. So I actually think, people are so frustrated with and just resigned to the existing system and all its faults that I think that's part of why we don't produce better laws on these things. I think if we actually made at least one part of the law just work much better, then people might go, oh, maybe we could do that with other parts too. And you'd get more activity trying to fix the other parts because you'd realize, hey, change is possible. We could do better. So I think a lot of it is just sort of apathy from just feeling defeated by the system that, it just can't be changed and it can't be made better. And if you could just do any one part of it much better and show people, that could, change the attitudes.
So, I mean, since you are fond of measuring everything, is this something that can actually be quantified? Like on the margin right now, this proposal will actually lead to something that's more beneficial than it is costly. Are those calculations that we can do?
There, you certainly try. I mean, I don't know who's done them, but I would just do it through itemizing. I would say, let's take each particular law and ask how often is it enforced, and then, do some estimate whether it's a socially valuable law, right? So you can take drug laws and say, maybe those are negative, but you got to have robbery and rape and murder and a whole bunch of other laws. And I'm going to go, those are pretty clearly good laws. And, we could at least measure out the percentage of people that you would claim are there for bad laws. And as you may know, like under the current system, supposedly, when people think somebody's guilty of murder, it's too hard to convict them of murder. So they often convict them of something easier to convict of. So they go find a drug crime or a gun crime or something. And so that means a lot of the people who are there under drug or gun crimes really are guilty of something else. I mean, that's not a very trustworthy system to have to punish people. But if on average that's roughly true, then that speaks better for the system, basically.
Yeah, I have more follow-up questions, but I'll probably ask them at the end.
All right, Aslam, you had a few questions.
Hi, Robin.
Hi.
I just remember reading Elephant in the Brain way back, and just how it affected my sort of particularly masculine side, I should say. Really related. I really felt so true. I'm so glad somebody's mentioning this finally. But I wanted to ask you some more. I wanted to ask you questions about your worldview. How do you imagine, so I think I will change the order of the couple questions that I've asked, but I was just wondering, what do you think that the rights and responsibilities of humans and entities that they created are towards each other? And what type of relationship you would, suggest that would be the most effective? And
Pretty
then,
big question.
how would you really reinitialize, or have to change, because you've just you mentioned that which parts of the system that you wouldn't touch, or like you would touch with your proposal, but since everything's connected, all they just are connected to each other, and I think your focus is predominantly US. You're suggesting this for US sovereignty, or I mean, I don't know if you're just suggesting the model could be all
Suggesting for anybody who's willing to try it. I mean, I'm happy to be opportunistic about trials.
Yeah, I'm actually really wondering about your, overall modeling, because, you're just addressing one thing. I really would like to mention the complex systems like secondary, third effects and so forth. And especially because you're only cherry picking some parts of it, even in the story. I'm just wondering, as a continuation of that, like that worldview of like how you see rights and responsibilities, how their relationships should be, including like, should things be punished, or how they should be. And then you're also tying it with assets and liabilities. Like, even if we just take the assets and liabilities that are existing, how do you see the distribution being divvied out? I mean, for example, if you look at the distribution of assets and liabilities globally, and particularly in the US, there is such asymmetry already. So if you start and impose your system on top of it, have you thought about the ramifications of it? And I guess, like, my last question, which was my first, if everything worked out exactly as you imagine, how would it be like in next couple decades without changing anything else? Because, I mean, we're not proposing to change anything else.
So
Everything stays.
Don't ask more questions, because I only remember these so far, and I hope I'll remember them.
Yeah, so maybe, I mean, which one you'd like to start?
So
Maybe
the last one seems easiest, so I'll start there.
yeah.
The image here is that with the system, after, say, a couple decades of experience, people get used to it. Basically, there would just be a lot less crime, and the expense of preventing it would also be a lot lower. There would be fewer police investigating crime, fewer lawyers prosecuting crime, fewer jails and jailers running, punishment systems. It would just be a much smaller system, because it would just be working more efficiently, assuming we don't change the laws in response. Now, people might say, oh, well, now we could have some more laws. We had some laws we thought of doing before, but we thought, oh, that would be too expensive, we weren't doing it. But now we're going to have some more laws, and they might go wild adding more criminal laws. And, that would be more risky. But among the laws we have, the first image would be just, well, stuff would be, more effective, more efficient. Like, crime-ridden neighborhoods wouldn't be crime-ridden anymore. People who have lives of crime would have other lives, and the whole system around them at the moment to punish them and protect, and divert them and negotiate with them would all be much smaller and, go away. That would be the main hope for the long run if you did that. So that was the third question. The second question, I think you said, was about assets and like inequality, basically, which is related to Evan's question, I think. Basically, in a world of inequality, how does this play out differently? And so basically, vouchers, require that are somebody with assets, basically. So the vouchers are the people with assets who basically need to approve you. So you need to get somebody with assets to basically team up with you and say they back you, and therefore those people will, whatever concerns they have about what they are convinced by in you to make them be willing to trust you, then you'll have to accommodate those concerns. And so you might think of that as some way in which you are subservient to them, if you want to think about it that way. But I would just think more about it as like you have to get an employer to trust you enough to hire you as a job, or you have to get a school to trust you enough to choose you as a student. You have to get a voucher to trust you enough to choose. And I think that's just about the relationships. And I don't know that it has that much to do with inequality, other than the fact that most people couldn't vouch for themselves. Basically the fact is, if everybody was rich enough, then they could all vouch for themselves and we wouldn't need other people to be our vouchers. And we're not going to be in that world for a long time. So you got to get somebody else. And I think your first question was basically, what do I think about duties and responsibilities and rights? And basically, I actually I tend to sort of want to think in other terms besides morality when I do policy analysis, actually. So I have some stuff on what I call dealism. And I sort of tend to think of, well, people have what they want, but it's good to come together to coordinate to achieve what we want together. We make various kinds of deals. Some of them are formal deals of organizations, some are government deals, and some of them are even norms that we agree to create together because they think they help us all. And moral norms are one of the key sets of norms. But I think more of these are things we choose because they help us. And that's how I think of rights and responsibilities. I think, well, what rights and responsibilities would be good ideas? If we had those rights and responsibilities, how would it make for a better world? And so I'm looking for the kinds of rights and responsibilities, which if we decided that those were the ones we all had, the world would end up being a better world as a result. And if you tell me about a right that I could give out and I'd say, but that would make a worse world, I don't want to give out that right, then I'll say, I'm not really supporting that right because it's not going to make the world better.
Could I ask something? Well, I was just wondering, Robin, it's like if we start, because I'm trying to really earnestly imagine how it would really work out if we just implemented the changes that you're suggesting, and if we just put everything, morality and all that, like aside, and rights and etc. But just from the perspective of like assets and liabilities, like currently, we've had Noam Chomsky, and he just mentioned how about 0.1% of assets being controlled by, world's assets controlled by like 0.1% of the population. So those would be the vouchers. I mean, they would dispense the voucher like in totality because they already have the assets to vouch for. So basically the 0.1% of world would vouch for the 99.9% of the world. So that would sound to me be like an effective pure slavery in a way. So, but just maybe I'm misunderstanding.
Most of the relationships you have in your life with schools and with employers and with, firms who sell you things and even with governments are relationships where they have a lot more assets than you do. If having a relationship with an entity who has more assets than you makes you a slave, then you've been a slave for a long time because that's the world you've been living in for a long time. I'd say it doesn't make you a slave because you have competition that lets you choose among them. You don't have to be an employer's slave because you can choose among other employers. You don't have to be a landlord's slave because you can choose among other landlords. Therefore, I mean, I get that many people are concerned about inequality, want to do something about it, but not all problems are fundamentally about inequality. There are other things that go wrong in the world, and we could try to fix those other problems without necessarily addressing inequality. Not to say that inequality isn't worthy of addressing, but it's just not at the root of all problems in the world. There are other problems in the world besides inequality. And crime, I would say, is fundamentally has some of these other big problems.
Do you want one more follow-up or?
Take another question.
Okay. Yeah. I'm just.
Yeah, I think I just when we combine, we're not touching like any rights or equality and so forth like that. I was just really thinking cumulatively because I'm very quantitative. I was just trying to extrapolate. Okay, so if we just have like the 0.1% vouch for the others, what kind of system would emerge? Would that make the world better? Because that's like since you use that to make the world better. So, and then I was just thinking, make the world better, even if it works. So like, I guess, because I mean, my mind goes completely like I'm like a contract law crazy person too. All the scenarios of what kind of contracts you can create with your system. And some could be really super horrendous because we could just have the kinds of punishments if you just combine that are way worse than just killing someone. So that's why, I mean, I'm just.
But if that happens, it'll be because people choose it. That is, you will have a person who is potentially at risk of committing a crime, who is trying to convince a voucher that they are a safe enough risk, and they are choosing to say, well, if I do this, then you can do the following punishments to me. And I can convince you that that is a threat that I will take seriously. That is a threat that really will dissuade me. And they are choosing that threat. And that seems to me a valid choice. We want to let people choose for themselves what punishment regime would be most effective for them, including horrific punishments if they want to so choose. But it's now not the rest of our responsibility to say, we've enforced this terrible punishment on them. We say they chose that punishment. They wanted that punishment exactly because they wanted it to be a credible threat to push them away. And that makes sense to me.
Okay. So maybe Gray, you dropped another question. I don't know if you're still there. Maybe I'll read it on her behalf, and we can end here. So a common topic at the STOA is there's no positive modern conception of the elite. Do you see potential for vouchers to provide a new model of what that is to be positively socially engaged, powerful person?
Well, I guess part of what might happen is you might have different kinds of vouchers who distinguish themselves by their different style of vouching. And some of those could be thought of as an elite, I guess. So for example, like some churches might say, well, if you join our church and are a member in a good standing, then the church will vouch for you. And now you're using this church not just for other purposes, but also for reassuring the world that you are, not going to be a criminal. And you might have other people who are just individuals who say, I'm rich and I'm just going to go out and be a voucher, and I'm going to pick the people I think are actually good risks that in my social network they seem to think. So basically, people would probably search in the space of, how could I have a relationship with somebody who has a lot of money such that my network of relationships convinces them that I'm a good risk and they will want to back me. And that's not what we do today for automobile insurance, for example. I mean, I'd say automobile insurance, we have, require you to vouch, but it's a small enough contract that you don't sort of reorganize your life around it. You don't, suck up to people or try to join a club or something like that in order to reduce your automobile insurance premiums. But you might imagine for some people, at least if their crime risk was high enough, they might organize their lives more around joining some groups or being parts of some communities, such that those communities themselves would specifically convince somebody that they were a good risk. And certainly people have done that in the past. Historically, many organizations in society, through the centuries, were ways in which people, by joining the organization, could convince some larger world that they were trustworthy and, could safely interact with them. And so vouching is sort of returning to something like that, basically saying, let's search for how we could set up organizations and groups of people and networks of people such that it gives reassurance enough that somebody will say, yes, they're in my church. Yes, they're in my network of friends. Yes, I know them and they come to parties. Yes, we grow up together, something. So they say, yes, I will vouch for them. I don't know if that's elites per se, but you could see elites would be involved in it, because in any one of these worlds, there will be people who are more respected and more elite in these worlds, and they will more influence those worlds. And in some sense, to become, treated as a safe person in that world, you may well need the elites to back you. For example, the church elites may need to back you for the church to decide that the church will vouch for you.
All right. So I think we're at the hour, so it's probably good to end here. Robin, any closing thoughts you have for us?
Thank you all for taking my wild idea seriously enough to engage it. And, I'm eager sort of to hear more about ideas about variations on these sorts of things, but just thank you for listening.
Very Cool. We should have a series of the Stoa, Wild Ideas with Robin Hanson. And you
I've got
come
more.
I imagine.
Got
You do.
lots more wild ideas.
Cool. So Robin, would love to have you back at the Stoa. Thank you for coming today. You can check out more events at thestoa.ca. We have a Patreon, Substack. If you want to continue this conversation, we have a Discord. The next event is a Social Design Club. It's coming in 30 minutes with Joe Edelman. So you can check that out. It's going to be some speed dating kind of thing he's going to experiment with. So that should be cool. All right, everyone. Thank you for coming to the Stoa today.